V19 May's recent copier publisher. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I'm 63 years old now, but this story begins when I was just 43. I never thought I'd be sitting in front of a camera, telling strangers about the most horrific discovery of my life. But here I am. And I feel like I need to share this to warn others, to finally let this burden go. You know, it's funny how we can live in a place for years and never truly know its secrets. The house on Oakwood Lane looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. A two-story Victorian with peeling blue paint, a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the east side, and a garden that had seen better days. I inherited it from my Aunt Meredith after she passed away rather suddenly. Heart attack, they said. No one questioned it. I remember the day I moved in, July 17th, 2005. The air was thick with humidity, and a storm was brewing on the horizon. The moving company had cancelled last minute, so I was left to haul all my belongings inside by myself. By nightfall, I had only managed to bring in the essentials: a mattress, some clothes, and a few kitchen items. I collapsed onto that bare mattress, sweating and exhausted, listening to the old house creaking around me. That first night, I heard the scratching. It was faint. So faint, I convinced myself it was just tree branches against the siding, or maybe mice. Old houses always have mice, right? The house needed work. A lot of work. Aunt Meredith hadn't been able to maintain it properly in her final years. The wallpaper was peeling in most rooms. The hardwood floors were scuffed beyond repair, and there was a persistent musty smell that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. But it was mine now, and I was determined to restore it to its former glory. I should mention that I work from home as a technical writer. I've always been a bit of a loner, so the isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I preferred it. My neighbors, the Hendersons and the Callahans, tried to welcome me with casseroles and invitations to barbecues, but I politely declined. I didn't move to Millfield for the social scene. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be left alone with my work and my house. The first few months were dedicated to the essentials: fixing the leaky roof, replacing the ancient water heater, updating the electrical system. Basic survival stuff. But once winter passed and spring arrived, I turned my attention to the cosmetic issues. I started with the living room, carefully stripping away layers of wallpaper that had accumulated over decades. That's when I first noticed the strange texture of the walls. Behind the wallpaper, instead of plaster or drywall, there was a rough, uneven surface. I assumed it was just old-fashioned construction methods. After all, the house was built in 1887. I covered it with a layer of modern drywall and painted over it. Problem solved. Or so I thought. The scratching continued. Sometimes at night, sometimes during the day, always just on the edge of hearing. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or maybe squirrels in the attic. I set traps, but never caught anything. Years passed. I worked my way through the house room by room, updating and repairing. The kitchen took nearly 6 months. The upstairs bathroom, with its clawfoot tub and intricate tile work, took almost a year to restore properly. I became obsessed with doing everything the right way, preserving what could be saved and carefully updating what couldn't. The house became my life's work. I didn't have many visitors. My parents had passed away years before, and I never married or had children. Occasionally, a colleague would stop by, or a delivery person would comment on the improvements they could see from the porch. "You've really transformed this place," they'd say. If only they knew what was hiding beneath the surface. 10 years after moving in, I finally tackled the dining room. It was the most ornate room in the house, with elaborate crown molding and a built-in china cabinet that had seen better days. As I was removing the cabinet to repair it, I noticed a small gap in the wall behind it. Just a tiny opening, maybe half an inch wide, where the wall didn't quite meet the floor. Out of curiosity, I shone a flashlight into the gap. I expected to see insulation, maybe some wiring. Instead, I saw something white and curved, something that looked disturbingly like bone. Pause. Take a deep breath. I told myself it couldn't be what I thought. Maybe it was just some animal that had gotten trapped in the wall and died. A raccoon or a possum. That had to be it. I convinced myself to ignore it. I patched the gap with some caulk and reinstalled the cabinet. Out of sight, out of mind. But the scratching got louder after that. And sometimes late at night, I thought I could hear whispering, faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from inside the walls. I started having trouble sleeping. I would lie awake for hours, listening, wondering if I was losing my mind. I threw myself into my work, both my technical writing and the house renovations. I started taking sleeping pills to help me get through the night. They dulled the sounds, or at least dulled my awareness of them. Life went on. 5 more years passed. I had worked my way through most of the house by then. The only rooms left were the 3 upstairs bedrooms. I had been using one of them as my bedroom since I moved in, leaving the other 2 for storage. I decided it was finally time to tackle my bedroom, to tear up the stained carpet, refinish the hard wood underneath, and repaint the dingy walls. I moved my bed and other furniture to one of the spare rooms and got to work. The carpet came up easily, revealing beautiful oak floors beneath. They were in surprisingly good condition, needing only a light sanding and refinishing. The walls were another story. The previous wallpaper had been stripped at some point and painted over, but the paint was bubbling in places, indicating moisture problems. As I scraped at one bubble, a chunk of plaster came away in my hand, and there it was again. That strange, rough texture I'd noticed years before in the living room. But this time, I looked closer. The rough surface wasn't old plaster or unusual building materials. It was bone. Small bones fused together with some kind of mortar. What I had initially taken for an unusual plastering technique was actually human remains. Long pause. Visually disturbed. I stumbled back, dropping my scraper. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself I had to be mistaken. This couldn't be real. But as I forced myself to look again, to really look, there was no denying what I was seeing. Those were finger bones, and over there, what looked like part of a rib cage. I ran from the room, barely making it to the bathroom before I vomited. I sat on the cold tile floor for hours, trying to process what I had seen, trying to decide what to do. The rational part of my brain said to call the police immediately. But another part of me, the part that had spent 20 years lovingly restoring this house, resisted. What would happen to my home? It would become a crime scene. It would be torn apart, its secrets exposed. And what about me? Would I be a suspect? Would people believe
My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I told myself I had to be mistaken. This couldn't be real. But as I forced myself to look again, to really look, there was no denying what I was seeing. Those were finger bones. And over there, what looked like part of a rib cage. I ran from the room, barely making it to the bathroom before I vomited. I sat on the cold tile floor for hours, trying to process what I had seen, trying to decide what to do. The rational part of my brain said to call the police immediately, but another part of me, the part that had spent 20 years lovingly restoring this house, resisted. What would happen to my home? It would become a crime scene. It would be torn apart, its secrets exposed. And what about me? Would I be a suspect? Would people believe I had no idea what was in my walls? I decided I needed to know more before I involved the authorities. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. So I went back to that bedroom with a hammer and began to carefully chip away at the wall. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. The entire wall, from floor to ceiling, was lined with human bones. They had been broken into pieces and mixed with some kind of cement to form a grotesque insulation. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae, even small bones from hands and feet, all compressed together into a macabre collage. I moved to another wall, then another. They were all the same. I checked the floor below, tapping with my hammer until I found a hollow spot. I pried up the floorboards and found more bones layered between the joists. The house wasn't just insulated with bones, it was built with them. I spent that night in my car, parked at a rest stop off the highway. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in that house, not now that I knew. The next morning, I went to the local library and began researching the history of my house. It took days of digging through old newspapers on microfiche and dusty town records, but eventually I found something. In 1885, 2 years before my house was officially built, a doctor named Elias Blackwood purchased the land. Dr. Blackwood had run a private sanitarium in Boston before relocating to Millfield for what the newspaper called health reasons. The sanitarium records were harder to access, but with some persistence and a small donation to the Massachusetts Historical Society, I was able to view them. What I found chilled me to the bone. Dr. Blackwood's sanitarium had an unusually high mortality rate. Patients checked in with minor ailments, melancholia, feminine hysteria, nervous exhaustion, and many never checked out. Their deaths were attributed to complications or sudden decline. More disturbing still, the bodies were rarely claimed by family members. Dr. Blackwood offered to handle the burials himself for a modest fee. The record showed over 100 unclaimed bodies during the 10 years the sanitarium operated. But there were no records of where these bodies were buried. No cemetery plots purchased, no death certificates filed with the proper authorities. They had simply disappeared. Until now, I realized with growing horror. that Dr. Blackwood hadn't moved to Millfield for his health. He had moved there to build his dream house, a house insulated with the remains of his unclaimed patients, the ultimate form of recycling. But why? Was it just practicality? Free building materials? Or was there something more sinister at work? The scratching I had heard for years, the whispering. Were these the restless spirits of Blackwood's victims? I returned to the house with a new sense of purpose. I needed to document everything before contacting the authorities. I took photographs of the exposed bones in my bedroom wall. I used my hammer to check other walls throughout the house, marking with tape the areas that sounded hollow or unusual. As I worked, I began to notice patterns. The bones weren't randomly distributed. They formed shapes, crude symbols that reminded me of the protective sigils I had seen in books about medieval superstitions. Was Blackwood trying to harness some dark power? Did he believe that by surrounding himself with the dead, he could absorb their life force, extend his own life, gain power over death itself? The whispering grew louder as I worked, as if the spirits knew I had discovered their secret. Sometimes I could almost make out words. Release us. Revenge. Blackwood. On my third day of investigation, I found something in the attic, a hidden compartment behind a false wall. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. It was Blackwood's diary. I spent all night reading it, unable to tear myself away despite the mounting horror. Blackwood hadn't just used the bones for practical purposes. He believed that by surrounding himself with the dead, he could absorb their life force, extend his own life, gain power over death itself. The diary detailed his experiments, how he would select patients who seemed to have the most vital energy, how he would slowly poison them, draining their life while keeping them conscious enough to experience their own demise. He believed that fear and awareness at the moment of death made the spirits more potent, more useful for his purposes. The final pages of the diary became increasingly incoherent. Blackwood wrote about hearing voices, feeling watched. He became convinced that the spirits were plotting against him. The last entry, dated September 3rd, 1905, simply read, "They are in the walls. They are waiting. They know." There was no record of what happened to Blackwood after that. According to town records, the house stood empty for several years before being purchased by a family named Whittemore in 1912. They lived there for only 8 months before selling it at a significant loss. After that, the house changed hands repeatedly, never owned by the same family for more than a few years, until it came to my Aunt Meredith in 1978. My aunt had lived in the house for 27 years. Had she known about the bones? Had she heard the scratching, the whispering? She had always been a private person, keeping to herself much as I did. Had the house discovered the truth and chosen to keep it secret? Or had the house claimed her too, as it had claimed so many others? I thought about the heart attack that had taken her so suddenly. I thought about the strange dreams I'd been having since moving in. Dreams of suffocation, of walls closing in around me. Had the house been trying to claim me as well? I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called the police. They didn't believe me at first. The detective who came to take my statement looked at me like I was crazy. But when I showed him the exposed wall in my bedroom, the color drained from his face. Within hours, my house was swarming with police officers, forensic technicians, and eventually representatives from the State Historical Society and a team of archaeologists. The investigation took months. They carefully dismantled sections of wall throughout the house, documenting and preserving the remains they found. The final count was staggering. bones from at least 137 individuals, men, women, and even children, all buried within the walls, floors, and ceilings of my home. DNA testing was attempted, but after more than a century, there wasn't much viable genetic material to work with. Still, they managed to identify a few individuals based on dental records and unique physical characteristics noted in Blackwood Sanitarium files. Most of the victims remained anonymous, forgotten souls whose final resting place had been my house. I couldn't live there anymore, of course. I moved into a small apartment in town while the investigation continued. The house was eventually declared a crime scene and then a historical site of significant importance. There was talk of turning it into a museum, but local residents protested. In the end, the decision was made to respectfully remove all the remains for proper burial and then demolish the house. I watched from across the street as they tore it down. 20 years of my life reduced to rubble in the matter of hours. I should have felt sad, I suppose, but mostly I felt relief. The whispering had stopped. The scratching was gone. The victims of Dr. Blackwood could finally rest in peace. But sometimes late at night, I still hear them. Not from the walls now, but in my dreams. They whisper to me about Blackwood, about his experiments, about the power he sought to harness. They tell me that destroying the house wasn't enough, that part of Blackwood's essence and the essence of his victims was absorbed into the very soil of that property. Nothing has been built on that land since the demolition. The town council rezoned it as a small park with a discreet memorial to the victims, but nothing grows there. The grass withers.